A peaceful life before the storm. Before everything changed, my life felt wonderfully ordinary. My name is Emily Carter, and I was 31 years old when the world I knew started to unravel. I lived in a small, friendly town in Oregon with my husband Mark and our precious 2-year-old daughter, Olivia. Our home was a cozy cottage just a few blocks from the river, with a white picket fence and a swing set that Mark had built for Olivia's second birthday. Each morning, I'd wake to the soft sounds of birds outside our window, the smell of Mark's coffee brewing in the kitchen, and the cheerful giggles of our daughter playing in her room. Mark worked as an architect for a local firm, and I ran a small bakery right downtown. Life was a careful balance of work, family, and the little pauses in between. Spontaneous Sunday picnics in the park, evenings spent watching old movies, and sunrise walks along the riverbank. Our neighbors often commented on how closely knit we seemed as a family, always looking after one another. Even when times got tough, when Olivia caught her first fever or Mark struggled with a stressful project at work, we managed to hold everything together. I felt deeply grateful for every part of it, never imagining that things could shift so suddenly, so permanently. Family had always meant everything to me. As an only child raised by a single mother, I promised myself that my own daughter would have all the stability and warmth I once longed for. Mark and I shared dreams about raising Olivia in this sleepy little town, watching her grow up surrounded by a loving community. Looking back now, sometimes I wish I could freeze that version of my life, hold on a little longer to the comfort and certainty before the storm rolled in and changed everything. Tragedy knocks at my door. I remember the day everything shattered with a vividness I'll never escape. It was the cusp of fall, a chill in the air, leaves beginning to blaze, yellow and red. That morning, Daniel kissed me goodbye, smiling the way he always did, promising he'd be home in time for dinner. Hours later, my world tilted on its axis. The police came to my door with grim faces, their words sounding unreal as they gently explained that Daniel had died in a car accident on the highway outside town. It didn't make sense. Nothing about it felt real. I was numb. Grief was immediate, heavy, relentless, suffocating. I could barely process Daniel's absence. But as the funeral passed and days blurred together, another storm brewed. Daniel's family, people who had once welcomed me, began to turn. In quiet conversations and icy silences, I started to realize something had shifted. Their pain quickly transformed into suspicion and blame. They questioned every detail. Why was Daniel on that road? Why had he left work early? Whispers spread at the service, then louder accusations in the weeks after. I heard them say, "She knows more than she's letting on." They never asked how Noah or I were coping. Their grief turned to anger, and then full blame aimed right at me. Soon, the heartbreak of losing Daniel was dwarfed by a new terror. His family threatened legal action over Noah, accusing me not just of being an unfit mother, but even of having a hand, somehow, in Daniel's death. Each day, I woke up dreading what fresh accusation might come. Friends seemed to vanish, unsure how to help. The community that once felt like a blanket of support now grew cold and distant, as if I were living behind glass they could not touch. Despite my brokenness, I clung to Noah, his small hand in mine, the feel of his hair as I soothed him to sleep. I'd lost Daniel, but I refused to lose my son. Even surrounded by whispers, fear, and overwhelming grief, I made a quiet promise. I would fight whatever darkness came next, for both of us. My in-laws and their cunning trap. After David's funeral, a new, more insidious hardship began to take root. I didn't notice it at first. My in-laws, the Harpers, seemed full of grief, and I tried hard to be understanding. David's parents, Thomas and Eleanor, had always been formal, reserved people, pillars of their community with ties stretching deep into local business and politics. During our marriage, I often felt like an outsider, a polite guest in their world of country clubs and private dinners. But I believed that deep down, they wanted the best for their son and grandson. At first, Eleanor called almost daily, asking after Ethan's health and my state of mind. I appreciated her concern, though the calls often felt a bit more like interviews than conversations. She'd ask what Ethan ate for breakfast, what time he slept, how he was coping. I chalked it up to a grandmother's worry, but slowly, things shifted. Thomas began sending family lawyers to help me navigate estate paperwork. There were forms I didn't understand, endless meetings to attend, and suggestions that perhaps Ethan should spend more time at the Harper estate to ease the transition. One afternoon, when Ethan was at a playdate, Eleanor dropped by unexpectedly. She brought a casserole and a clipped tone. We sat awkwardly in the living room, and I sensed a new coldness in her demeanor. She began questioning my job, my finances, even my emotional health, all laced with a smile. She implied that a single mother with limited resources might not be able to provide everything Ethan deserves. My instincts screamed that something was wrong. Soon, the polite inquiries shifted to thinly veiled criticisms. Eleanor expressed concerns to the preschool director about my capacity to care for Ethan alone. Thomas's lawyers asked for documents about Ethan's medical appointments, suggesting that they might supervise his next checkup. The final straw came when, one morning, I received a certified letter, an official notice. The Harpers were seeking custody of my son. The letter alleged I was unstable, grieving to the point of neglect, and that I could not support Ethan's emotional or material needs. The accusations stung, not only for their falsity, but for the blunt force with which they were delivered. Their lawyers drew up affidavits, calling on any moment of weakness I'd admitted to in the fog of grief. My refrigerator was suddenly filled with daily wellness checks from neighbors I knew had been contacted. Even Ethan's pediatrician, someone I trusted, called to say she'd been approached for records. It wasn't just the legal assault that hurt. It was the tidal wave of gossip that swept through our community. Former friends avoided my eyes at the grocery store, and I heard whispers in the school parking lot. You know, the Harpers always did think Madison married up. I wonder what really happened that day. My world shrank, sifted of comfort and trust. I spent sleepless nights reading legal codes, calling any friend willing to listen, seeking out advocacy groups for single mothers. A neighbor I'd known for years quietly offered the name of a local attorney who'd gone through a similar ordeal. I gathered every piece of paperwork, school notes, doctor's reports, emails, anything that could show Ethan was safe, cared for, and loved. I refused to let fear win, but I was terrified of waking up one day and finding Ethan's room empty. Eleanor and Thomas grew bolder. They offered settlements if I relinquished partial custody. They hinted at scandals. They threatened to bring everything to light if I persisted. I started locking my doors, worrying for the first time, not just about custody, but my own safety. I was never truly alone. My phone rang with blocked numbers, anonymous messages urging me to do what's best for Ethan. But every night, after tucking Ethan in and listening to his soft, even breaths, a resolve hardened inside me. I would fight with everything I had for his sake. I couldn't let the Harpers rewrite the story of my family, or take from Ethan the mother who loved him more than life. I was scared, but I was certain I would not fall into their trap. Not quietly, not without a battle. The relentless fight, refusing to back down. You never know how strong you are, really, truly are, until you have no choice but to stand firm. When the Millers launched their full campaign to pry Henry from me, it felt as though the ground beneath my feet had disappeared. Yet, somewhere in my marrow, the fight only made me more determined. My first move was simple: refuse to isolate myself, even as the walls of gossip and suspicion closed in. I reached out to the few loyal friends still willing to pick up the phone. Late nights, I called old college classmates in Chicago and a cousin who worked for a family law nonprofit. I joined online groups for single parents and, hesitantly, shakily, texted the name of a lawyer I'd once helped with floral arrangements for her partner's engagement party. She agreed to meet me for coffee the next morning. The fear was always there. Every time the doorbell rang or my phone buzzed, my stomach twisted itself in knots. I worried that Henry, already so lost without his father, would sense my anxiety. So I tried, to keep our home filled with light. I filled our kitchen with music in the mornings, danced with him after work, and read extra stories every night to anchor him in routine. I snapped photos of us, making pancakes, raking leaves, snuggled under throws, watching movies, not for Instagram, but as the living proof of our bond and his happiness. Of course, the Millers didn't relent. Margaret cornered the director at Henry's preschool, pressing her about my emotional health. Charles's lawyer called local doctors for my records. When the formal hearing started, the Millers arrived with a team of attorneys, clutching carefully documented lists of my every perceived mistake. Henry's missed nap, a payment for counseling, the evidence that I'd let my mother stay for a weekend without proper supervision. Their lawyers tried to paint me as unstable, overwhelmed, and incapable. I started keeping a detailed diary, logging every activity and emotion, not for my own therapy, but as a weapon, proof that Henry was thriving. I collected receipts, school notes, pediatrician records, and recommendations from church leaders and neighbors still brave enough to speak. My nights belonged to research, family law, custody precedents, stories of other parents who'd fought and won. I reached out to a family investigator, someone my lawyer recommended, who quietly began looking into the Millers' own background and motives. The legal process was brutal. The custody assessment alone was a drain. Endless home visits, questionnaires about parenting philosophy, interviews in gray-carpeted offices where strangers judged the most private parts of our hearts. Henry grew clingier, quiet and withdrawn, but never stopped trusting me. I clung to my lawyer's advice. Let every accusation pass through you. Answer clearly. Keep your dignity. You are a good mother, and the truth will outrun their lies, she reminded me when I crumbled. But the fight didn't only happen in court. The Millers' money fueled rumors. A story circulated that I'd been negligent. Another that James had been planning to leave me. When my finances grew tight, I considered selling the flower shop. But a family friend stepped in with a loan. Anything to keep going. Anything to keep Henry with me. Sometimes, late at night with Henry asleep and the house silent, I'd let myself cry. Huge, racking fits of loss, fear, and rage. But in the morning, I'd patch myself together and march on. My lawyer called my resolve steely. I was just a mother too exhausted to feel anything but determination. The day I took the stand, testifying on my own behalf, I realized this fight was about more than Henry and me. It was about refusing to surrender my story to people who believed power entitled them to rewrite our truth. I spoke of James, of love, of the promise I made to our son. I showed the photos, the records, the notes, and bedtime drawings. As the judge listened, I looked at Henry, seated quietly at the back, coloring with a friend while the grown-ups argued over his fate. Every cell in my body thrummed with the need to protect my child. The Millers' legal fireworks couldn't drown out that primal, unwavering force. No matter how long the fight lasted, I would never back down. If I lost everything else, my reputation, my business, my money, I was resolved. I would never lose my son without the fiercest battle I could wage. The earth-shattering secret, uncovered, reeling from courtroom arguments and late-night crises. I was already running on reserves I didn't know I had left. Still, something never quite sat right with the narratives the Monroes, especially Charles, my late husband Peter's father, kept pushing. After all, Peter's accident had always been described as just that, an accident. But there were tiny cracks in the story, fragments that never made sense the more I looked back on them. And late one night, those doubts began to coalesce into a stubborn urge for answers. I hadn't meant to pry, but when I found a letter in Peter's old desk drawer while gathering papers for court, I froze. It was addressed to someone I didn't recognize. To Jay. It was cryptic, only a few lines, but the phrases lingered with me. You said I had no choice. I want to protect Rachel and Dylan. My heart pounded. I knew Peter hadn't been himself the weeks before he died. Distant, haunted even, but I'd always chalked it up to normal stress. Now I wondered, had there been something darker? I dug deeper. Late-night internet searches, awkward conversations with Peter's colleagues, and even a hesitant call to a private investigator. Rachel, what are you doing? Became my new normal. I learned things I wish I hadn't. Charles Monroe had quietly tried to influence the insurance company, pushing for fast processing and raising uncomfortable questions before I'd even seen Peter's body. The official police report was perfunctory, dismissive. A single vehicle accident, closed quickly. But one local officer, Officer Kyle, still remembered. I asked for his help, citing my custody battle and mounting fear that the Monroes were hiding more than just disappointment in my parenting. Officer Kyle reopened the file. There were inconsistencies, a skid mark pattern that didn't match up, witness statements ignored or minimized, including one from a truck driver who'd said he saw another car speed away from the scene, minutes before police arrived. That's when the real horror struck. Examining Peter's phone records, I found a string of calls from an unlisted number belonging to Peter's half-brother, Aaron Monroe. Aaron and Charles had always been distant, but they shared one thing, a vested interest in the Monroe family trust and legacy. I started piecing together what I wish had never been true. On the morning of Peter's death, Aaron had left his job in a neighboring town at the same time Peter's car left school, a route Peter had never driven before. An abandoned security camera outside a gas station, retrieved at my urging by the tenacious Officer Kyle, revealed a chilling interaction. Aaron and Peter, harsh words exchanged. Aaron grabbing Peter's arm, and later, Aaron's car tailing Peter's onto the rural highway where the accident would happen. Shaken, I confronted Miranda, who, in a rare slip, let her cold composure thaw into panic. She begged me not to pursue things further, her voice breaking as she admitted she knew something awful, but was afraid of what her husband would do if the truth came out. I pressed on. I filed a formal request through Rebecca and Officer Kyle for a renewed investigation. The full picture that emerged was devastating. Aaron, desperate to win his father's approval, and, more tangibly, a larger share of the family trust, had threatened Peter, confronting him about how he planned to change his will in favor of Dylan and me. A heated argument escalated. The evidence, circumstantial but compelling, pointed to Aaron deliberately running Peter off the road. Charles Monroe's influence had all but pressured the sheriff to close the case quickly, afraid of scandal. I could barely breathe as police reopened the case. Miranda confessed to the authorities, her guilt and grief finally overpowering decades of silence. Aaron was arrested, and the Monroes' facade of concern fell apart in the courtroom. Their lawyers tried to downplay what happened, but public records, new witness accounts, and Miranda's own testimony made it impossible. The entire community was rocked. What looked like the accident of a beloved teacher had been, in fact, a calculated act of family greed and manipulation. The shock, the betrayal, the heartbreak. I sometimes wonder how I stayed standing through it all. But I did. For Dylan, the truth had finally found air. And with it, my resolve grew only sharper. No one would take my son from me now. Not after all the darkness we'd survived together. Justice restored. There's no exact moment, no single second, when justice returns after so much turmoil. It doesn't bust down the door in a blaze of glory or come with dramatic fanfare. For me, it was more like sunrise, slow, gradual, and at first I doubted it was real at all. Even after the truth about Aaron and Charles was brought to light, even after the police arrested Aaron and reopened every file, a part of me still braced for another storm. Trust is not something you can snap back into place after years of manipulation and fear. But step by step, things started to shift. The first sign was when Officer Kyle called and asked if he could come by the house, not with more questions, but with paperwork signaling I was no longer under suspicion. That day, I sat at the kitchen table, breathing deeply, relishing a quiet I hadn't felt in years. Ethan played in the living room as the golden afternoon light filtered through our window, oblivious to how the tectonic plates of our lives were finally settling into a place that felt safe again. The legal proceedings felt both exhilarating and exhausting. My lawyer guided me through hearings and meetings with a kind of respect and support I'd rarely experienced from the outside world. The tide had shifted. The Monroe family, once so powerful and untouchable, began to unravel in courtrooms they once dominated. Their network of support thinned as evidence became undeniable, and the town that had once believed the worst of me now seemed more uncertain, even apologetic. I wasn't naive. Healing didn't mean everyone suddenly liked me or even believed me, but it meant Ethan could sleep without nightmares again, could go to school without whispered rumors chased in his wake. When the judge reviewed the new evidence, listened to Miranda's testimony and the results of the reopened investigation, she was clear and concise in her ruling. Custody of Ethan would return to me, the mother who had been unjustly accused and unfairly hounded for years. I barely remember the moment the ruling was read. My hands shook and my lawyer beamed at me, squeezing my arm in quiet celebration. Ethan, at just 6 years old, could sense the relief that flooded our home, though I tried to shield him from the bitter details. That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself sleep without fear. For the first time, it was our house again, just us and the simple joy of being safe. Rebuilding life isn't glamorous. The media, which at first swarmed the Monroes' downfall, gradually faded away, leaving us with a strange blend of privacy and notoriety. Some people would always remember my face as the widow at the center of a small-town tragedy. Others would offer awkward smiles, shy apologies for their distance or coldness. I did my best to accept it all with grace, returning every kindness and letting go of old wounds where I could. Ethan asked questions, some deep, some heartbreakingly innocent. Why did Grandpa Charles try to take me away? Was it because of something I did? Explaining the tangled motives of adults to a child is impossible, so I stuck to what mattered most. He was safe, loved, and none of this was his fault. I promised him, as I'd promised myself so many nights before, that no one would ever separate us again. I enrolled him in therapy and kept our routines as gentle and predictable as possible. In small moments, playing catch in the backyard, reading books curled together on the couch, I could see him coming back to himself. Each time I caught his laughter, spontaneous and bright, I felt another piece of my own heart knit back together. Legally, my victory was decisive. The Monroes lost not only the custody battle, but a good deal of their standing in the community. Miranda, who'd finally chosen honesty over fear, quietly reached out to me after Aaron's conviction. We met once in a crowded coffee shop, her hands shaking as much as mine. She told me she was sorry for her silence, for the years of pretending. I believed her. In that moment, we weren't adversaries. We were two women, pulled into a web not entirely of our own making. The process of truly forgiving, though, is far harder. I struggled with bitterness, with nights when I'd lie awake, cataloging every slight, every moment of humiliation and hurt. I journaled. I meditated. I relied on the few close friends who had never abandoned me. Slowly, I let go, not for the Monroe's sake, but for mine and Ethan's. Holding on to rage felt like continuing a battle that was already won. Letting go was my way of clearing space for new light to enter our lives. Practical matters filled my days, sorting through finances after legal fees, repairing friendships where I could, and building a future for Ethan that was free from fear. My bakery became more than a source of income. It was a place of renewal. Neighbors who had once whispered behind my back started stopping by for coffee, sharing stories of their own losses and struggles. The simple act of working each day, crafting something sweet and nourishing, became my anchor to the ordinary joy that had once defined my life. One afternoon, months after the judge's ruling, I found myself at the riverbank where Mark and I had once walked with Olivia. Ethan skipped ahead, chasing the last golden leaves as they fell from the trees. The air was crisp, the sky impossibly blue, and for the first time in years, I let myself feel hope without caution. Grief, I knew, would never entirely disappear, but it no longer overshadowed every ordinary happiness. Life was not the same as before, but beauty and peace had returned in ways I never expected. Ethan is older now, wiser, more thoughtful than most children his age. The ordeal left scars on both of us, but it also strengthened a bond that nothing and no one could break. When we talk about the past, I am honest but gentle. I remind him that families are complicated, that pain and joy often exist side by side, and that courage is not the absence of fear, but the determination to face the future anyway. Justice for us did not mean the end of struggle or the return of a lost innocence, but it meant a chance to begin again, to choose compassion over suspicion, and to build a life on truth. Now, when Ethan falls asleep at night, curled up with his favorite stuffed bear, I look at him and know beyond all doubt that everything I fought for, every sleepless night, every battle, every heartbreak, was worth it. We aren't just survivors. We are a family, remade by resilience, And finally, after so many years, free to dream about tomorrow. The journey of resilience and motherhood. Looking back over the maze of pain, accusation, legal battles, and the unrelenting winds of rumor, I'm sometimes stunned by the pure audacity of making it through. From the quiet, sunlit days before my life flipped upside down to the aching nights after everything crumbled, the only constant thread was my love for Ethan. Even in the darkest hours, when sleep was a stranger, when I couldn't tell hope from delusion, I became someone I barely recognized, someone unbreakable. That strength was never an angry shield, but a deep, quiet well I drew from. With every small act of care, every stifled sob, every morning, I found the will to rise and try again.
Tell us where the gun is.
You never truly know just how resilient you are until you're tested by fire. That's an overused saying, maybe. But now I understand it on a bone-deep level. The strange thing about surviving such a public and personal crisis is how it rewires the entire way you relate to the world around you. People saw only snapshots, the court dates, the teary statements outside an old brick courthouse, the glare of news vans. They didn't see the rituals that kept me and Ethan afloat. The whispered bedtime promises, I'm here, I'll always be here. The way I counted the breaths it took to calm him when nightmares gave chase. The fierce pride with which I packed his school lunches, even on days when I could barely muster an appetite myself. As the months passed, after justice was finally restored to our lives, I realized that the world wasn't going to hand out medals or offer parades for surviving hell. But with each sunrise, I began the slow, stubborn rebuilding of who I was and who I wanted to be for Ethan. There was a raw, unvarnished honesty to life in the aftermath. We both had scars, invisible but deep, and no amount of cheerful small talk or pretty home decor could disguise the shadow that sometimes drifted through our days. But I made a sacred commitment to my son, to reclaim our joy, stitch by stitch, together. I let myself lean into the simplicity of our routines. A trip to the farmer's market every Saturday, pancakes on Sunday mornings, the ritual of choosing a library book and then reading it twice before bed. These might seem trivial, but after years spent fighting for the right to parent him, they became anchors of meaning. Ethan was different after everything. He had a wisdom in his eyes, a sensitivity that made him old beyond his years, but also an innocence I was desperate to protect. In the years following the custody trial, I enrolled him in counseling, and together we learned the language of healing, naming our feelings, sitting with them, letting them pass without shame. Some afternoons, he'd ask me the hardest questions like, was there ever a time when you wanted to give up? I always tried to answer honestly. Yes, of course, but giving up would have meant handing over my love for you into the hands of people who didn't understand us. I never wanted that. Honesty, I discovered, was both my sword and my shield. Protection against the poison of secrets that had almost destroyed my family. There were setbacks, of course, flare-ups of anxiety for me, moments when Ethan recoiled from the mention of his grandparents' name, nights when sleep was ruined by the echoes of old fears. But there were also victories. The day Ethan won a ribbon in the school science fair, looking for me first in the crowd, I felt a kind of triumph no verdict could match. Work, too, became a cornerstone of our new life. The bakery felt different now. For a long time, I worried the townspeople would never move past the headlines or their expectations. But over time, people began to see me not as an object of scandal, but as someone who had survived and chosen not to hide. A few mothers lingered over coffee, sharing their own stories, the quiet, untold struggles behind perfect exteriors. I found a strange confidence in vulnerability. The more I told my truth, the lighter I felt, the more rooted I became in my own skin. Motherhood after trauma is a particular kind of balancing act. I never wanted Ethan to carry the weight of my pain, but I also didn't want to wrap our life in denial or silence. We talked, we wrote letters to feelings we couldn't speak out loud. We made art and music. Sometimes we allowed sadness in, welcomed it, honored it, and then let it pass so new joy could take root. Responsibility didn't just mean feeding or sheltering my son. It meant showing him that love grows strongest in the ashes of what's been lost. Slowly, I reclaimed small pleasures. Walks by the river, birthday parties without the anxiety of who might judge us, even dating again, tentatively, learning that trust could be rebuilt, brick by patient brick. Every relationship, every decision became an act of faith. I had learned not to measure life by ease or comfort, but by the amount of courage I could bring to each day. My relationship with Ethan changed, deepened, as he grew. He asked questions I didn't always know how to answer. Why do people hurt each other? Will you ever leave me? Those were the hardest conversations. I always tried to answer with honesty and compassion. I told him that people act out of fear sometimes, or out of their own unhealed pain. I promised him, again and again, that I would never leave, that our family might look different from others. But the strength of our love was unshakable. Even in this newfound safety, challenges remained. Facing everyday parenthood after extraordinary chaos sometimes felt almost surreal. There were days when worries about money, lingering shame, or flashes of old trauma overwhelmed me. But those were the days I dug my roots in deeper, reaching out to my community, practicing gratitude for the small victories, nurturing friendships that had survived the storm. In all these things, I rediscovered myself, not just as a mother fighting for her child, but as a woman with dreams, talents, and dignity, untouched by others' judgment. For every tear I shed over what was lost, I tried to build 2 joyful memories in its place. Sometimes, the best healing came from watching Ethan laugh without restraint, the sound echoing through our home like a hymn. There were moments, rare but real, when the old story tried to intrude. A well-meaning neighbor's uncomfortable glance, a news article dredged up from the past, a misguided teacher's question. But each time, I reminded myself, and Ethan, of how far we'd come. We're not the sum of our wounds. We're the sum of every moment we chose love, integrity, and hope instead of despair. I also learned, to my own surprise, to forgive, not because those who had harmed us deserved it, but because carrying their bitterness would ruin the future Ethan and I were crafting together. Forgiveness wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was 1,000 tiny choices: to answer hostility with calm, to refuse the bait of old arguments, to believe in the possibility of goodness despite all we'd known. Motherhood, I now know, is not about perfection. It's about showing up again and again with whatever strength you have left. It's about holding your child close and daring to believe that love really can be the final word, the foundation on which everything else is built. This journey taught me that resilience isn't just enduring the storm, but learning how to dance in the rain, hand in hand with the person who matters most. Our story, messy, public, hard-fought, became a quiet inspiration to a handful of others. I started volunteering at a local support group for single mothers, sharing legal tips and, sometimes, simply sitting with women whose voices shook as mine used to. Together, we laughed, cried, learned which lawyers to call, what documents to keep, and how to survive the worst nights. Helping others became a mirror, seeing my strength in their eyes, reclaiming my sense of worth, and building a legacy for Ethan that I could finally be proud of. Every anniversary of our victory in court, Ethan and I plant something new in our backyard. A tree, a rose bush, some wildflowers that spread in the summer sun. It's our way of marking not just what we survived, but the life we've chosen to create in its wake. The garden isn't perfect. Some plants die, weeds creep in, but every year it grows stronger. A tapestry of persistence and hope. Sometimes I wonder how Ethan will remember all this when he's grown. The whispers, the fear, the long afternoons spent clinging together through storms of doubt. My hope is that he doesn't remember the pain most. I hope he remembers the resilience, the unexpected kindnesses, and the fierce, gentle love that carried us through. Whatever comes next, we'll meet it together, as we always have. Resilient, unbowed, and grateful for every day we get to share as mother and son.